Hey, thanks for checking out this week's video. As usual, I'll go over the materials I used, my general process on making this piece, but I'm also going to talk a bit about the fear of overworking your art, which I really struggled with during this painting. So for the materials, I used a Faber-Castell mechanical pencil with HB lead, Winsor and Newton gouache, Faber-Castell Polychromos coloured pencils, some silver watercolour and Langton hot pressed paper. For a full list of everything that I use, you'll find it in the description box below. This is my second gouache piece, and just like the first one, I wanted to start really strong with a good sketch so that I didn't have to rely on my limited painting skills to make it look nice. And I am actually going to be doing a video on the digital sketches and mock-ups and how I transfer them to paper soon, so keep an eye out for that if you're interested. I started lightly shading using a paper stump to blend out the graphite that I'd already laid down in the sketch, but eventually I do swap to a brush. I've only just discovered using brushes to soften and blend pencil recently. I find it actually gives a much smoother blend as well. Usually with the paper stumps, I find they streak and can give a really uneven coverage, although they do seem to work better on coloured pencils, so they are still handy to have around. Quick note here, I added far too much water and paint to this wash that it instantly buckled the paper and it did not dry flat. I even had to use extra masking tape to keep it held down to the drawing board. I do fix this problem right at the end of the video though. I'm still very new to colour mixing in a traditional sense, so I tend to stick to a limited palette. Basically picking a few tubes of paint and only using those either straight from the tube but preferably mixed together to create the colours that I'll use, and that way they all stay quite harmonious. I knew I wanted blue hair, I don't know why, I just really wanted to try it, so I referred to my colour wheel just to confirm what other colours would work well with it. I do have an understanding of colour theory, but I find looking at a colour wheel, whether online or a physical one in person, helps just to confirm what I'm thinking. If you're unsure of your colour theory, or if you just like friendly reminders like I do, I suggest getting a paper colour wheel. A lot of them have a spinning element and you'll be able to show you various colour schemes like split complementary, and you'll be able to match it up with the exact colours that you want. They're really handy and they're very inexpensive too. So from this, I knew that yellows and warm oranges that I would relate to the skin tone would work well. Another cool thing about understanding the colour wheel, especially when it comes to colour mixing, is that if you create a hue that's just too saturated, adding a bit of the opposite colour on the colour wheel will desaturate it without muddying or clouding the hue itself like it would if you were to use black or white. So it's really handy to know. So as not to bore you, I'll just give my basic approach to layering with the gouache. It's watered down a lot, so I can essentially use it like watercolour and build up the opacity if I want later on with additional layers. With watercolour you would normally work light to dark because you can't go any lighter, but gouache means that you can, so you do have the option to add lighter shades later on. I always paint wet on wet, which means that I add a clean layer of water over the area I'm working on first, and then while it's still wet, I add the paint to get a smoother layer as possible. I then always wait for these areas to completely dry before going back over them, or even if it comes to working on an area nearby, just to avoid them leaking together. Sometimes you want that for a nice colour transition or blend, but I always find it so hard to control and I end up with harsh lines and bleeding where I don't want it, so for the time being I'm letting everything dry first. Something that I learned in digital art that applies to all portrait art regardless of what medium you're using is learning the colour zones of a face. The most obvious zone is the middle section that covers the cheeks and nose, and I'm sure you can guess that colour is red. Another zone is the forehead, which is yellow, and then the jaw and chin area that can be green, blue or grey. These are of course very subtle hue shifts, but they really do make a difference. You can see that I add blue shadows under the lips, above and under the eyes as well. A bit later on I think I emphasize this more with coloured pencils too. I'll link some useful references below if you're interested. Now I feel it's time to swap to coloured pencils. These really help me to define my edges more and add a bit more vibrancy too. You'll see me scribbling on a piece of paper before I start. That's me just trying to figure out which colours match the best. I only have a small set of Polychromos, I think it's 36 pencils, but I was happy with what I chose. They instantly help it stand out. I tried to pick a darker but more saturated colour that matched the area I was using them on. One thing I like to do with lines is to thicken where two edges overlap or meet. You'll notice it more probably on the flower. I guess it's just personal preference, but I find the varying of the line weight makes a nice effect. And it's really satisfying for me to do as well. I really enjoy that part. Another method to try if you wanted to vary your line weight is to unify it with your light source. So whatever's nearest your light source would be a thin line, and what would be in the shadows would be thicker. So for example, if I were to do it in this piece, I would have done thin lines on the top of the petals and thicker underneath where the light wasn't hitting. It's around this point that I really start hesitating. I always find that I struggle to push myself further just in case I ruin my art, like rendering details more or adding a background or another element like a flower, or even just pushing my values further. In fact, for this piece I really wanted to try and add some rain to it. I loved the idea of it dripping off her face and down onto the petals and maybe off the page, but I just couldn't bring myself to try in case I completely ruined it. And I know you can just start again, but the time it takes aside, I don't know if I'm even going to like what I do the second time around. This fear always stays with me when I'm creating traditional work specifically. I guess that's what I miss about digital art. You can experiment as much as you like, and if it doesn't work, then you can just delete the layer and move on. I'd love to know if others struggle with this too and how you handle it. I'm thinking I could start doing a very specific study first, almost like a trial run of the painting that I'd want to do. That way I can quickly find my colour combinations, as well as trying out anything experimental on a rough, much smaller scale before doing it on the final piece. To hop back to what's happening in the video, I've just started adding highlights with thick gouache. At some point I tried adding highlights with pastel pencil because I was so nervous of the paint, that pesky fear again. It didn't work, obviously, so I decided, since I was so worried that I'd mess things up, that I'd use two brushes. One to apply the white gouache and the other to soften the edges. And this is my favourite bit of this whole piece, and I'm so sad that you can't see the silver as I'm painting it. I had to move the light to a certain angle so I could even see it myself. I think my face was practically on the paper because straight on, like you see in the video, it's barely visible. This is the first time I'd properly used this rigger brush. It's got really long hairs and it looks quite intimidating to use, but you actually get quite a lot of control, more than you would expect. You get these really nice thin lines, which was just perfect for the silver embellishment. A bit more coloured pencil to finish off, and that's about it. I included removing the masking tape to show a common issue I have. Earlier I mentioned that I put too much water on the paper for a wash and it buckled quite a bit. Probably didn't help that I never stretched the paper either. Oops. I ended up adding extra layers of this masking tape to hold it down. You can see the first layer of tape that is left has actually come away from my drawing board. It has warped so much. To remove the tape, I'd read peeling it at a 45-degree angle reduces the chances of it ripping the paper. Now the masking tape I'm using is really cheap and the glue on it is actually quite strong. I even actually stick it to my clothing first before I put it on the paper, just to try and take away some of the strength of the glue. And this tape had been on for weeks as well while I was chipping away at it, so I was kind of expecting the worst. It did tear a little bit on the corner and it damaged a bit at the top as well, but it is within the area that I was going to trim anyway, so overall I think I got pretty lucky. Now to fix the buckled paper. I sprayed water over the back using a bottle. The spray wasn't as even as I liked, so I went over with a brush. And now it's barely wet. I add more water than this when I add a new layer of paint, if that helps give an indication of how much I used. Then I used a bit of kitchen towel over the back and piled on some heavy books and an old iPad. I think I left it 2 to 3 hours and then repeated the process again afterwards until it was completely flat. I feel I did push myself a bit more with this than I did on my first gouache piece. So perhaps with every piece I can delve a bit further into understanding this medium. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please do give it a like, and if you want to see more, then hit that subscribe button. Until next time, bye!